Okay.
And 3, 2, 1. Here we are in paradise. Question mark.
Question mark.
Hawaii, Oahu.
Indeed.
Volcanoes blasting off on islands beyond.
Exactly.
This is Who is Jon Ray with Clark Patrick. Clark, where are we at right now?
Aloha, John. We are in a very beautiful setting. We are sitting on a park bench across from Waikiki Beach, right next to the Honolulu Zoo, next to a beautiful Gandhi statue, which is random but very cool. And we're sitting under a couple extremely large banyan trees, which are very beautiful trees. And there's many people moving around us. And it's sunny. And yeah, it's by some people's definition paradise, right?
Yeah, so let's talk about that because I didn't know this many people would be allowed into paradise.
Right?
You had an interesting tidbit for me that I had never heard before, and it was basically why Honolulu and Oahu kind of became the tourist sensation that it was. Tell me a little bit about why this, of all the islands, why this was the island that kind of got branded as the tourist destination of paradise.
Yeah, right. So from my understanding of how different elements of Hawaii have developed over time, in maybe the earliest point, maybe the 40s, but definitely in the 50s, when coming out of World War II and the American population was really starting to have some disposable income for the first time, and families were starting to take destination vacations. Developers recognized that Hawaii was a beautiful place and that this was a place that they could make a destination for tourism. And at that time, before the development happened in Oahu, people were coming out exploring the islands. And where I live on the Big Island, on the Hilo side, they started building a really large airport that was going to function as sort of this hub for a lot of tourism coming to Hawaii, but for functional reasons, structural reasons, because airplanes had a limited range, more limited than they do now, they sort of recognized that they couldn't actually get the planes to the Big Island in one stop at that period of time. And almost exclusively because of plane limitations, they realized that the closer islands were going to be a better place for development, and Oahu became kind of the center of that. And I think on some level it also had to do with the beaches, and like where we are right here in Waikiki, there's one really long, sandy, beautiful beach, beautiful water, and it's just like structurally, like that's the spot to make like a really the tourist destination. And it grew astronomically from there. You know, like where we are now, Oahu is the most populated island. Honolulu has literally millions of residents. There's tall skyscrapers. You know, in a lot of ways, it's almost like Las Vegas, you know. And none of the other islands have that kind of degree of environment, you know. So it's a major thing, but yeah.
Well, and when you think about Hawaii, you think tropical paradise, and a lot of that is because that's the way that it's been portrayed in Hollywood and in the movies. And of course, it's beautiful. We're looking out at the ocean right now. It's this crystal clear blue water. There's palm trees, all kinds of vegetation just behind the beach. And you know, even looking back on the city, seeing all the hotels along this giant strip of beach is beautiful. But as you venture a few blocks into the island, it is one giant shopping mall. And there's just millions of people walking around with shopping bags. And for me, this being my first time in Hawaii, it was a little bit of a jarring experience because it's not what I had expected. I was expecting it to be, I guess, a little bit more rural. And Honolulu being kind of this tourist hub has become almost a concocted event or paradise where
Yeah.
everything seems somewhat commercialized. And
Yeah.
now I don't want to discount the beauty of this place because it's been amazing. And on the other side of the island, we've seen some really interesting places and beautiful mountains where things like Jurassic Park and Jumanji and a lot of those kind of picturesque, jungly island movies are shot.
Yep.
But, one of the things that when I come out the next time I'll do is make sure that I'm spending a little bit of time on the other islands as well because, in the context of paradise, for me, paradise is much more about exploring and being able to see the beauty in nature and not necessarily be trapped in a shopping mall.
Yeah, I mean, of course. And, so digging deeper into the concept of paradise, right? So I live on the Big Island, and I've been living there about 4 years. And as a transplant, it's a big move to change your whole life, to come out to the middle of the ocean, to move to a place like Hawaii. Just physically, it's the most remote location in the entire world in relationship to any other land masses. So it's a major move to do that. And I think for anyone that makes that move, there has to be this underlying reason of like why they need to do something that's that extreme almost. And I think for a lot of people, there is almost a subconscious thing that they feel if they get to Hawaii, if they get to their idealized version of paradise, that their life will be better, or that they will escape something, or they will be healing from something, or something along those lines. And so like a fact that's interesting, and I'd have to look it up to double confirm it, but I've heard this a few times, which is that Hawaii, the state of Hawaii, has the highest level of suicide of any state in the United States. And that's not per capita. That's literally the most amount of people that kill themselves in Hawaii. And what I think, and there is a literal phenomenon of people come here on vacation, or they move here, and they're so crushed by the fact that their idealized version of paradise does not solve their pain or their problems, that they can't bear living in such a beautiful place with the pain that they have. And so there are tons of people who move here and kill themselves. And that's like an unbelievable thing. And that is like, you're not going to read that on a tourism brochure anywhere, and that's something that, the state itself as a government doesn't want to talk about, but it's like, that is a heavy, heavy load, from a psychological perspective. And
Well, and it's kind of the idea behind commercialism to a certain extent is something external from you can solve all of your problems. And as long as you're willing to spend the price tag, then you can ease or find relief for a lot of your problems. And that's an interesting statistic, and even if it's a somewhat off, the fact that it's happening at all in any capacity just goes to show that there's not always, especially to existential problems, you're not going to be able to solve all of those by getting the external circumstances just right. A lot of that has to be dealt with internally, and it's one of those things where, like, anytime somebody's talking about paradise or utopia, I've been calling that the utopia trap. It's like, if I can just get all of these things in my life lined up and all of the external circumstances right, and the right boyfriend or girlfriend, or if my boyfriend or girlfriend acts this way, and if I have this home and this car, then all of my life will be in order and I'll feel fulfilled. And we kind of get caught in that trap where utopia has to keep escalating and keep reinventing itself. And really, the true utopia in my estimation, it lives inside of us, and it's about being able to be at peace and satisfied and pleased and in appreciation of wherever you happen to be in the world.
Yeah.
Now, it's much easier to be in appreciation of a beautiful place like this here in Oahu and Hawaii, and surrounded by kind of the aesthetic and energy of people who are in a more carefree space because they're on vacation. But at some point, I think that it's important to turn inward and find that paradise that lives within you. And unfortunately, my experience has been, in order to find that paradise, you first have to work through all of the dirty, dark secrets that live inside of you. And as you clear those away, you start to see some of those blue waters of your heart.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and I agree. I mean, I agree completely. But, one thing, so, I mean, you and I have been friends for many years, and we haven't really talked about this before in relation to my experience living here the last 4 years. But one thing I can say just for myself personally, in my own personal experience, is that coming to this place, before I got here, I felt like I was being very conscious that I was not running away from something, but I was running towards something. Like, I was not trying to escape elements of myself, or I was not trying to, run away from my fears or past or whatever. And then when I got here, not immediately, but pretty early on, although I felt a certain element that I was moving towards something, that I actually was trying to escape a lot. And I had a couple personal things. One was, when I moved here, I had very bad chest pains for a year, extreme chest pains, and I was going to the doctors, and the healthcare system in Hawaii is pretty poor, so that's another thing that isn't necessarily on the tourism brochure, but is true. And so they weren't able to really resolve it. They couldn't get to the bottom to it. So I was physically suffering with chest pains for like a whole year, and it was just crushing because because of the not knowing of where it was coming from. And some of it was physical, but also some of it was emotional and related to my past, and this sort of thing of like, I really was running away from some things, right? And in the end, I figured out what the physical issue was, and it wasn't that big of a deal, and we were able to resolve it, and it was good. But through the process of just like physically being in pain, and then being out here on my own without my normal family and friends and culture, and I was living in a rural area and working alone and just suffering, I was able to actually move through a lot of it and clear out a lot of these things that I needed to work on. But what I will say, as kind of an extra point to that, is it's almost harder to do it here than anywhere else, because the fact that you're in such a beautiful place almost kind of throws into your face that you're suffering even more. And so it's like, I think on some level that is how these people come and commit suicide here, because it's one thing to feel an unbearable like depression or sadness or pain in a shitty place. Like, if you physically, like, you live in a dirty city in the subway and you're just, their life is terrible and whatever, you can sort of blame it on that, and like, and no one would say, they're not going to say that's wrong. But here, if you're like in a deep, dark sadness and depression and physical pain and stuff, and you're like sitting next to a beautiful beach in the most beautiful place in the world, it's crushing for you. It's really crushing. And I think that is almost like the irony or the like ironicness to like being in paradise. Is like, if you can't be happy here, kind of in your spirit that you never can be, and that's such a painful like thing to have to kind of like confront, You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, and I think, depending on how you see it, it sounds like it could be a really interesting catalyst to starting to do some of the internal work. But I could see how if you don't have the right tools in your tool belt to be able to deal
Yeah.
with that existential funk,
Yeah.
then it can be really difficult to go on, because here is the place that that maybe more than any other place has been branded as paradise, and
Right.
has been branded as, the escape to Hawaii and escape your worries.
Yep.
And here you
Yep.
are, and you are feeling those in an even heavier way. I can see how that could be, almost debilitating in a lot of ways.
Totally.
So how, when you came here, how did you confront that, and what were the tools that you used to kind of move through that?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, before I had lived in Hawaii, I had spent a couple different periods of time in basically extreme isolation. I had spent a 21-day period of time alone, in total silence without communicating anyone, and I was, it's not worth explaining the whole thing, but I saw the sunrise and sunset every day. I was in a rural area, and that experience was right around when I turned 30, and I had a lot of other I had a lot of personal things going on that were difficult for me. And what happened to me in that process was different than what's happened to me here, but it's worth explaining as a precursor, basically. Is what happened to me when I did that was, the first few days of being alone in silence like that, I just was thinking about and processing really regular kind of surface level daily activities, just thinking about my life back home and, just regular stuff. But pretty quickly my mind just moved into this direction of like really deeply evaluating my whole life and like my entire history and all of my relationships, and I was really, I think, intentionally looking for patterns, and I was really asking myself, how did I end up here? Like, how did I end up in this place to be alone in silence for 21 days in a row? Like, what am I doing, And I identified a lot of patterns, some of which I was aware of, some of which I wasn't, some of which were positive, some of which were not. Or when I say not positive, I mean patterns in my life that did not serve me, that were not helping me grow or be a better person, and that were actually creating problems or resistance and like hurting me, or hurting other people around me. And when I finally had some clarity around what some of those, particularly the harder to deal with things were, I was just like crushed for a while, like, multiple days in this time of silence, and I felt very sad and very bad for myself and very depressed, and I was very, like, it hurt my self-esteem. I felt like I'm a really terrible person, and I most of my life have probably struggled with more of an overconfidence or an over ego perception of myself, not a low self-esteem, self-hating perception of myself. And so this was really heavy for me to be like, wow, I am a terrible, terrible person. Like, and not like just kidding. Like, I know it, it's true. But I experienced that, and then I kind of was able to have a breather and move back and realize, okay, that's not entirely who I am. I'm not entirely a bad person. I have some bad patterns. I have some, I've made some bad choices. I've hurt some people. But then I was able to kind of go, okay, that's not the whole story. And then I asked myself, okay, what can I do about it? And I spent a few days really processing this. Like, okay, well, can I let some of this go? Can I make changes? Is some of this easy? What is going to be hard? And in doing that, there was some things that right away I was just like, well, I can just stop doing that. I'll just stop doing that thing. And I know that that'll be easy I can do it. And then there were other things that I was like, okay, that's hard. Like, this is going to be very difficult for me to make these changes. Like, it's almost like an addiction. Like, I'm going to every day have to tell myself, you need to work on this, whatever it is, So I did that, and then a few more days, and then I get to the end of this whole process, and I felt so good because I had just gone through this entire emotional and physical and metaphysical roller coaster for a whole month, completely alone inside of myself. And I left that experience in a very cleared place, a very calm place, a very happy place, a very committed to my own improvement place. And I came home, and for the next couple of years, my life moved in a really good direction. And so interesting, and I'm getting to my experience in Hawaii in here in just a second, but I had a little bit of something that I can see now as an error in that process, where I told myself after that experience, I've got it all figured out. I felt to myself totally clear, totally free, totally fine, and I rode a wave of that freedom for a couple of years, and I felt like, man, I figured it out. But that did not last forever, and I started to come down again from that high.
Well, it's one of the ways that I've heard it put before is that we're constantly moving into these more expanded universes, and so at the bottom of each universe, we're still having to learn the rules of the universe, and so we make a lot of mistakes, and then we kind of start to balance out, and we're starting to get the hang of it, and then towards the top of the universe, we're pushing towards the limits, and it feels somewhat constricted, but we're also master over that universe. We've mastered all of the rules of that space. But then what happens, and I find this particularly when we go into moments of silence, because I really think that the next level of growth or expansion, or that next universe that's sitting on top of this one, speaks to us. It's calling us forward. And when we sit in silence, we get served up with the information and the feelings that need to come forward so that we can shed the barriers that keep us in this limited universe that we're in and allow us to expand beyond the current walls into the new one. But the paradox is that as soon as we expand into the new universe, all of a sudden we're at the bottom of a new universe, and there's a new set of rules and a new set of understandings and a new set of awareness that needs to be had in order for us to properly navigate that new universe. And so we're constantly going through this upward downward cycle of being at the top of a universe and master of our game, and then expanding beyond the limitations of that universe and moving into another one. And so we go from being a big fish in a small pond to now being a small fish in a big pond, and then we have to slowly grow until we're too big for that universe, and then we expand into the next one. And so it's this cyclical thing where we're constantly having an experience of mastery, and then, oh shit, I don't know anything. Mastery, oh shit, I don't know anything. Well, we still know everything that we knew. It's just that in the new game or the new landscape of reality that we're operating from, there are a much more subtle set of rules that we then have to learn to master.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it makes perfect sense. And, it's true to my experience of, so the second part of the story, like moving, my experience here in Hawaii, like, so I had this downward space and cycle. I spent all this time alone. I had these revelations, and then I had a good run for a couple of years, and then things started to slide again, and I was not happy where I was living physically, and I was not happy in different relationships, and a lot of things were going sideways on me, and I thought that I was moving to Hawaii to move sort of up rather than out, or I wasn't running away like I said earlier. But when I got here, it sort of became clear that actually I was doing that, and so then I had to confront that, which is, like, again, like I said, very hard in a beautiful physical place with this also culture and brand around it that it's paradise. And so what ended up happening for me is I once again kind of went into isolation, only this time I had a much different experience with it. It was horrible. It was like the worst ever, and it was crushing for me in a different way, because I didn't in the second time of isolation, I didn't get really the opportunity to, or I didn't get the answers. There was no answers. I just lived in a crushing state. And so, like, what happened for me is I was living in, I own a landscaping business, and I started out just working completely by myself, and all my clients are very wealthy, and they mostly do not live on the island, so I didn't even interact with my clients. I was spending all day working alone. I lived alone. I lived alone in a rural area, in a community with a lot of people that I didn't easily connect with. And so I spent almost all my time alone. And I had this physical chest pain that was unresolved, and this emotional pain, and I'm, isolated on the island. I couldn't even physically afford to leave the island if I wanted to, so I'm trapped here, basically. And I really leaned in to this darkness or depression that I was feeling, and I would say that it was very truly depression. And I also, it got very rainy in the place where I lived, and it was very moldy, and I literally got an infection in my lungs. And the lowest point for me was I spent an entire month basically in bed by myself in the country, in the rain, with an infection in my lungs and chest pains. And it was the deepest degree that I've experienced depression in my life, and I really barely had the tools to survive it. And you asked me earlier, what were my tools? And it's interesting because I developed a couple tools that helped me pull myself out of that space. And I think for anyone who suffers from a deep degree of depression, that these tools might possibly help someone else. And so it is worth sharing. But so one of the things that I did was I allowed myself to sleep all the time. Just all I did was sleep. And I had a friend who has also suffered deeply from depression, who she said to me something that was really important. She said, you can't die from sleeping too much. So if that's what you feel and you just can't get up and you can't get out of bed and you can't move on, then just accept that and lay there. And so that's what I did. I just slept for an entire month like Rip Van Winkle or something. But I had to. It's all I could do. And I allowed myself to accept that was okay. So that was one thing.
So let's talk about why that may or may not be an effective strategy. So for you, I think the interesting thing about sleep is that, more than any other place, it puts us into this kind of other dimensional realm. We all have some conscious awareness of having a dream or two at some point in our life. And I think our dreams can really speak to us. And so when we are suffering existential funk, our dreams can be a really interesting place for us to interface with some higher understanding of reality that might bring us a level of awareness or a clue as to which direction to go. But it's also, sleep is where we're rejuvenating our entire physical and energetic systems.
Yeah.
And so, as we navigate through physical reality and the dimensional spaces of the emotional and mental networks, I think that sometimes we can get really beat up, especially if we haven't been driving very well and have just been running into everything that we do, and maybe aren't 100% comfortable or familiar with how to keep the road on the track. And so maybe sleep is a way for us to kind of have this download experience from reality that resuscitates us to a certain point where we're harnessing enough energy to get over the hump. Did it feel something like that?
Yeah, I mean, completely. I had to.
Yeah.
Because I think it's like if you're in an energetic or emotional space that you feel like basically like your soul or your spirit is like dead or dying, then you don't have the physical capacity to do anything else either. But for me, the important thing was to allow myself that.
Yeah.
Because I think where people cross the line and do start to enter into this mental space of that I need to actually take my own life, is that they cannot figure out a way for them to be okay in any second of their waking life. I mean, they're so up against the wall emotionally, energetically, spiritually, physically, that there is no way out. And for me, that sleeping was a way out. But it wasn't the only thing. So to add to the other things that I did, I know that, there's a lot of research and just, common sense around the fact that exercise is good for you. It helps move your blood flow. It helps, change the chemicals in your brain that are the chemicals that are creating a part of this depression. And so I would sleep all the time, every day, but I forced myself to get up, and I would walk around my neighborhood alone in a very rural area. And I couldn't even really run because I didn't have enough energy, but I would go for a long walk every day, and I would listen to music, and I would try to talk on the phone to close family and friends and to try to keep myself okay. But a couple other things that I did that were really interesting, that were really effective for me, and they were not things that anyone told me, but were really helpful, is I started a practice of rubbing my feet, like giving myself a very long foot massage, like over an hour. And so every day I would give myself an hour long or more foot massage, because I basically I know that, in your nervous system, your nerves go all the way in, to your hands and your feet and your butt. Basically, those are like the nerve endings. And I've never necessarily enjoyed other people giving me a foot massage, or even just like doing it for myself. But I started doing that basically like feeling like this was going to physically help me calm down. And it really became a meditative thing for me, and it did help me. So that was one thing, and the walking and the sleeping. And then the other thing that I did, which I had heard about, and I'm sure you know about this, and it'd be interesting to hear your perspective on it, but is I had read about these things that are called binaural beats. And binaural beats is basically you listen to the intonation of essentially the energy vibration that is what your brain functions at. And so it's like alpha waves, delta waves, that kind of thing. And so I would listen to binaural beats for hours a day. To basically what I was trying to do is I was trying to tune my brain and my body back to an even place, and keep myself calm and put myself in a position to be able to physically move forward. So
I mean, I've definitely listened to a lot of different sound and frequency healing devices, and one that comes to mind is called the Rife machine, and there's an open source version called the Spooky 2. And essentially what Dr. Rife, I forget his first name, discovered was that each meridian in the body and each organ in the body and the brain itself operate at these different frequency levels. And when you create a feedback loop where you're sending those perfect blueprint frequencies into your body, they can delete or eliminate harmful pathogens, and they can also bring an unhealthy organ that maybe has fallen in frequency back up to the blueprint frequency. And so in a way it's like sound medicine. And I firmly believe that is an accurate form of healing. I think for me, one of the things that I'm experimenting with is moving beyond all of those different devices and any type of medicine, whether it be a pill or frequency or anything, not because it doesn't work. They all absolutely work, and I think that people should, somewhat use their intuition and go with the healing modality that makes sense for them.
Yep.
But for me, the experience that I'm interested in having right now is, will reality naturally give me the things that will trigger those frequencies and the healing that I need? And the way that I think I've moved through depression in the past, and how I've seen it effective for other people, is by letting reality trigger me in every single moment, by offering catalyst events, and then really asking myself, where do I feel this in my body? Because your emotions are just electrical and biochemical impulses that are going to certain parts of your body. And so reality can sometimes trigger you in a way that mentally you interpret as one thing, but really it's designed to get you to send energy and biochemicals to a certain area of your body. And so in that way, reality can create the catalyst events that actually trigger your own healing. And the more that I have kind of trust fallen into that concept, the more that I'm having a vivid experience of how everything from tragedy to elation is all serving to tune my mind, body, and soul in a very cohesive manner.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, that all of that, those statements, it's like, that's a really high level or a highly functioning place to be in. I mean, it sounds like, it's what's interesting is that sounds to me, it makes a lot of sense, and it seems like potentially real or the truth, but I do think that a lot of other people are not in that space yet. And so it's like, it's interesting, I mean, like, a question I would have for you about that is, like, for me personally, I don't feel like I'm there yet, or I don't live or exist in a daily way in that space. And maybe I wonder if you could say, okay, there is a specific point at which you crossed over from the type of experience that I'm talking about, like with where I was at when I first arrived into Hawaii and to where you are at now. Because for me, I could say, like, in my daily life and my daily experience, I feel like I've almost really only gotten myself back to a somewhat more neutral place. Like, I wouldn't say that I'm in a metaphysically positive place or, like, functioning at that level in the way that you just described it. Like, I understand what you're saying, but I'm not there. So it's like, for someone like me, how do you describe how you can move into that space,
Yeah, good question. And, I'm still experimenting to figure that out for myself and have my own experience of it. But I think a part of it is understanding that, in the metaphysical world, a lot of the practices that are offered are building protection and bubbles around things.
Yep.
So that you don't have to have an experience with something that's uncomfortable.
Right.
And, the first thing...
There's a term that's called spiritual avoidance. Yeah.
And it makes sense because, in a way, you're using these kind of energetic principles, and they absolutely work. I use them for many years successfully.
Right.
You can absolutely build a bubble around yourself and manipulate your own personal frequencies to draw in events that are congruent with what you feel is comfort. But at some point, it for me at least, it felt like I was expanding horizontally, but no longer expanding vertically.
Uh-huh.
And I was requiring too much control over reality. So I had to script out my entire day, and I had to constantly be in meditation. And I was always doing these different energy practices and breathing practices, and everything was going perfectly as long as I did those things. But I was starting to build an addiction to those practices, where if I gave them up, I would psychologically feel like, ooh, I might not have as good a day because I didn't do my full practice today.
Uh-huh.
And I was really interested in being able to have a walking meditation. Like, I didn't want to go lock myself in a closet all day long,
Right.
and I didn't want to constantly be having to build a crystal grid around whatever hotel room or house I was in order to feel safe. And
Right.
I think that it's really easy with a lot of different practices, whether they're, physical practices or metaphysical practices, to become reliant on the practice.
Oh, totally.
And I was really interested in removing my attachment to that. And so part of that was learning to see reality as a mirror, as I talk about, all the time to anybody who will listen. But
Yep.
it became less about how do I put makeup on what I see in the mirror, and instead learn to accept the natural state that I'm seeing. And kind of like you talked about, when I took those barriers down, the first thing that happened was this intense experience of me recognizing what a quote-unquote bad person I was, or how many mistakes I had made, or what a facade I had created around myself, the stories that I told so that people didn't have to actually know who I was. And so I didn't have to actually see who I was, which was this kind of flailing person who was trying to figure it out like everybody else, but who had made almost like a career out of pretending to have it all together.
Yeah.
And part of bringing those energetic and metaphysical barriers down was that I had to really start feeling and experiencing my life instead of energetically going out of body. And
Yeah.
I think with the style of metaphysics and Eastern philosophy that I was practicing, anytime something that seemed difficult came into my life, I would expand my energy out as much as I could so that I didn't have to sit. It was basically a way for me to dissipate the impact of the blow, and hold it in the protective field so that I didn't have to experience it in my body. And that became a depressing place because it felt like mystery was no longer there. I felt like, I was having to control everything. I was less in faith of the benevolence of reality, and more forcing myself to be in a practice. And if the practice wasn't going well, then maybe my life wasn't going to go well either. And in giving all of that up, and in every moment starting to say, okay, this is an interesting experience that I'm having. Where do I feel this in my body? Where do I feel this in my body? Where do I feel this in my body? I started to go back into my body, and I wasn't so energetically expanded out of myself. And, I started to have a vivid spectrum of emotions instead of this very limited bandwidth that I had been on for many, many years. And as soon as I started to feel deeply the sadness and the grief and everything that was being triggered within me, I was feeling sadness, but I wasn't having an experience of it. It's hard to describe because I think a lot of depression is spinning over it, trying to not have to feel it. And in actually going into the grief or the sorrow and feeling that and letting the tears come and letting whatever expression of that needed to come out, I started to feel much more alive. And more importantly, I started to feel much more courageous, and I had this massive awareness of all of the places that I was living from deep limitation because I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to control the scenario if I stepped fully into it. So I built a bubble that allowed me to not have to go there. And, fear, something that I had kind of avoided for a long time because I felt like you could create the right processes and do the right affirmations and get to a point where you didn't have fear, and then once the fear wasn't there, you could step forward. Well, that's a very long way of having an experience of reality if you have to pep talk yourself into every single thing. And what I became interested in, as I was constantly asking, where do I feel this in my body, was, what courage is is feeling the fear and doing it anyway. And so I started to read everything that I could about fear and about how to cultivate courage and what it meant to have a warrior stance on life. And my depression and some of the angst that I had went away because I started to feel capable of stepping into any scenario. And so there was a certain level of fearlessness that came along with that. And it wasn't faux fearlessness where I was just energetically protecting myself from something and so I felt safe.
Right.
It was fearlessness in that I didn't know what was going to be next, and I was comfortable in the not knowing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, that's a lot. But that makes sense. And do you think, because I suppose like the ways in which I could relate to that is, we were talking about this last night a little bit, that the way that a different way that I would frame that, or I would interpret all of what you just said, is almost an element of surrender, where in any situation at any time, if you're in a peaceful place where you're able to truly accept what is happening around you and with you and even within you, then that is a similar way of saying not living in fear. And then if you're in that space of surrender, then you can allow things to move through you. You can allow your emotions to move through you. You can allow experience to move through you, and you're not fighting against it, even if it is painful, or particularly if it's painful. It's like you're able to accept it because you're accepting everything, I don't know if that makes sense or not. But
well, it's like, think about a time that you felt like really in it and alive. Maybe it was at a music festival, or maybe it was like a salient event in your life, but you just felt like everything was lining up and going perfectly for you.
Yeah.
In that moment, you're able to release control because you are being bestowed with so much benevolent action by the universe or reality or God or whatever you want to call it, that you allow yourself to temporarily trust fall into whatever happens next, because you're like, I'm riding a good wave right now. You're almost not even in contact with the idea that might end at some point, because you're flying so high.
Right. Which is easy to do, particularly when everything is good.
Exactly. And so what happens is, when we go into fear and when everything isn't going well, we lose that faith that the next thing is going to be good. And then this sense of, I need to control it all because I don't believe that reality has benevolence in mind for me.
Right.
And so now all of a sudden we start spinning all these plates on sticks, and you can get to a point where you're pretending that you're controlling so many things, or actually are attempting to control so many things, that you're just completely wasting all of your energy.
Yeah.
And for me, that's what I was doing. I had learned a very artful form of controlling reality, but it was exhausting to keep it up.
Right.
And it required an intense amount of effort and time. And so at some point, what you're talking about, surrender, I had to let all the plates drop and trust that the pieces were going to land where they were supposed to land.
Yeah.
And I think that for me, it's an interesting experience to trust that God or reality is benevolent in nature, and that whatever is coming up is designed as a catalyst event to trigger me into a growth experience that will allow me to have the most fulfilling life that is available. Because we don't necessarily want to live inside a walled castle our entire life. There is a certain sense of exhilaration of stepping forth into the unknown jungle and having a face-to-face contact with the beast, and being able to learn something about yourself in that process. One of my favorite stories about certain tribal communities of the past is that instead of having a bat mitzvah where a bunch of people come and spend a bunch of money on you, and everybody drinks Mountain Dew and has hot dogs and tells you, hey, you're a man now, in tribal culture, some of them, they would send the young man out into the unknown, into the jungle, and he would have to spear a wolf or whatever beast it was out there. And part of that experience was him having to become so in tune with nature that often he would look the wolf or the beast in the eyes, and the beast and his soul would merge, and the beast would lay down his own life and accept that this rite of passage was okay with the beast, and that beast would become the boy's spirit animal, and the boy would bring the skin of that animal back to the tribe, and that was the symbol that the boy had become a man. And it's kind of like that's what we're at some intuitive level seeking, is to go out into the unknown, seize it, look it straight in the eyes, overwhelm it with our own benevolence, and then have that reflected back to us in a way that gives us the abundance to bring back to our community.
Yeah.
But the unknown is incredibly scary.
Yeah.
And so many people that I speak with and that I see on TV and that I work with in my coaching and the employees in some of my organizations, they're all not all of them, but a lot of them are seeking to build barriers around themselves so that they don't have to experience anything uncomfortable. And that we want to be expanding beings. We want to constantly be breaking our own limits. It's why we're so drawn to things like the Olympics and sports. Like, we love to see what human potential at its maximum looks like, and we desire that for ourselves, whether we acknowledge that or not. But so many of us have given up on the fact that we're capable of achieving anything beyond what we're achieving now, that we don't even put in the effort because it's uncomfortable. If we're talking about a physical achievement, it requires an immense amount of discipline to go in and do the training, both mental and physical, to be able to achieve something like that. Well, the same goes for achieving anything. There is a massive amount of discomfort in the training and in the discipline required that has to be drawn up within yourself in order to achieve something.
Yeah.
And for many, many years, almost most of my life likely, I was skirting that discipline and not understanding that true freedom comes from mastery over yourself and being so disciplined that you can do the hard work to build the infrastructure that allows an even larger landscape of freedom and navigation.
Yeah. Well, and that's, to that point, that was kind of connected to some of the things that we were talking to last night, where, one of the things that's something I've been thinking a lot about lately personally is my life in relation to other relationships and personal relationships I have going on. And I culturally, so we're American citizens, we live in the United States, and there's a lot of things that are kind of these overarching elements of our culture in the United States. And I think right now there is a lot of cultural focus on kind of a selfish perspective, on self-determination, on and there's a lot of shallowness in our culture with consumerism and entertainment, and there's a lot of reflection in society that the easy way is the best way because it's easy, so that's what you should do, and it's almost like that's what we all naturally want, the easy way to the success or the stardom or the money or the relationship. But it's like, of course that's not how it works. And so yeah, it's incredibly unpleasant in many situations, whether it's being an athlete or having a good relationship or successful business or whatever, where Like, you just have to show up and do the hard work. And that was the line that I said to you last night, that I say to myself all the time, that sometimes the really hard thing is really the right thing, or like maybe almost always that's the case, you know. But it's like living in this larger culture that is like, the easy thing is the fun thing, and that's the thing to do because that's the thing, you know. It's like, it's like, you know, it's very hard to take ownership over admitting to yourself you need to do the hard thing, you know?
Yeah, well, and I think, you know, it comes down to the concept of sacrifice.
Right.
Because
which is also connected to surrender.
Yeah.
You know?
And in some way, you have to be willing to sacrifice something now to gain something greater in the future.
Exactly.
And, you know, we, with social media and with the internet and with everything moving at the speed of light and at the speed of 140 characters, it becomes very difficult to get out of the emotional trap of instant gratification.
Totally.
Because we can have almost everything instantly now.
Yeah.
I can order us a pizza and it'll be here in 5 minutes. I don't have to get up out of this park bench.
Yep.
You know, instant gratification is what our world has become. And in a way, that's awesome. Like, it's technology has empowered us to do a lot more, to have a lot more reach. It has leveraged us in ways that we've never been leveraged before. It has put us into communication with people all over the globe, and there is power in that. But at the same time, I think it's important to take a step back and recognize that just because something can be done instantly doesn't always mean that it should.
Right.
And there might be a way that takes a little bit longer that is better. And, you know, that...
Or you know, maybe you don't even say better, but it is the outcome of the experience is worth the sacrifice. And so, you know, so if you think about it in terms of like an athlete or something like that, where you go, putting in all of those hard training hours to get into the race, and maybe you don't even win first place or whatever, but to accomplish your goal and, you know, beat your best time or whatever, when you look back and you go, man, all of that hard work and that effort, it was really worth it. And you feel like the accomplishment that you have, that you earned it because you know that you earned it. You know, and similarly with, say, a business or a relationship. Like, if you're in a relationship and it's really hard and you're struggling and you have to do a lot of work, but you do that, and then you get to the other side of it, and then you can look back and you know, like, deeply that you deserved the positive outcome of where your relationship is now. You know, like, so.
Well, and it's fun to climb mountains because the view at the top is really interesting, and and it's a completely different perspective of the world once you get up there.
It's to your point of expansion through the sacrifice and the effort and the accomplishment, you literally physically or metaphysically or spiritually are in a different space.
Yeah. And opening up the vantage point that we have of reality and the perspective that we have, and recognizing that the climb is worth it, is, in my experience, how we transcend things like depression. Because for me, my depression stemmed from me really wanting to do and be something, but being too much of a coward to go for it. And so I was just looking up at the mountain that was right in front of me, but never taking the first step to actually try and conquer it. And as soon as I said, fuck it, I'm just going to go for it, I'm just going to nosedive into reality, and if I make a bunch of mistakes, who cares? I started to have this very satisfying experience where it didn't even matter if I got to the top of the mountain because it was so much fun to be climbing it.
Yeah, right. Well, and so to go full circle and kind of like almost conclude my story about my early experience in Hawaii, I, you know, had this deep depression and physical pain and emotional pain, and was doing these things to get myself out of it. And I had one other element that really was kind of a saving grace for me in that really dark place, is that one of the days I was walking around the neighborhood where I lived, I just really had this total emotional breakdown where I had this thought, and it was an unbelievably simple thought, but it allowed me to be okay, release a lot of energy, and move forward, which was that basically that I said to myself, I was like, you know what? I asked myself the question, have you ever been deeply like soulfully happy before in your life? And I was like, yes, I have, you know? And I asked myself, will I be stuck in this hole forever? Like, am I never going to be able to get out of this depression? And I was like, no, I don't think that's the case. And so then I asked myself, is it possible that, you're going to move into and be able to go back into a place again, or even a more elevated place of really deep, soulful, happy joyfulness? And I'm like, yeah, of course that is going to happen for me in the future. I believe that. And then you take all of that together and you go, okay, is that going to last forever? No, probably not. And so it's like, it is kind of to the point of a lot of what you're saying, and my thoughts about the idea of surrender is that we have to accept the fact that our lives are process. And sometimes we're up, and sometimes we're down, and sometimes we're in the deepest depression we've ever experienced, that seems like we can't get out of. And sometimes every single element of our life is going our way, and it's just this complete euphoria of experience. But neither one of those things is permanent, and that we have to accept wherever we are in the process of our life at whatever time we're in it. And like, I was able to just accept the fact that right now, at that time, I was at the bottom, and I just had to allow for time to move forward and me to slowly recover from that and eventually get to a much better place, which is where I feel now. And what's interesting is where I feel now is I don't feel a euphoric high about my life, but I don't feel anything close to the depression that I was feeling at that time. And I'm grateful for both of those things, actually. And it's going full circle, talking about paradise. I think that maybe potentially one of the biggest problems with this utopia idea, a paradise or whatever, is that it is focused on a destination, on an ending point. If I can just get to Hawaii, or I can just get to this marriage or this money or whatever, that once you get to that point, then everything will become okay. And I just saw a really quick quote from Jim Carrey recently where he said something like, people find it amazing that you can get literally every single thing you've ever wanted and still be deeply unhappy. And he, he's like, I am rich and famous and powerful, and I am in a place where he's still can suffer from depression. And it's like, externally you go like, how could that be that someone could have everything and still feel so broken? Well, it's because life is a process. There's all different reasons. There is no destination. There is no paradise. There is no utopia. And like, the crushing part about living in a place that is like considered that is that you have to learn the hard way that it's not true.
Yeah, well, and maybe it's not that those type of experiences don't exist, because I think a lot of times people say, oh yeah, there's no utopia, there's no heaven, there's no anything,
right.
and it sounds like a really depressing, harsh statement. But really, what we're saying is that it's not linear. Like you're not moving from top to bottom and then all of a sudden you get to the top.
Yep.
Reality is multidimensional and has much more depth than that.
Yeah.
And what I think that maybe the idea of utopia is somewhat subjective and relational, because we acclimate to our experiences. So if I've been sitting in a desk for the last 5 years in a cubicle and haven't been able to see out of a window in 5 years, well, coming to Hawaii is going to be such a sensory overload that it's going to feel like a paradise scenario because the juxtaposition from what I'm used to is so vast. But if I then spend 5 years in this quote-unquote paradise, well, my sensory systems are going to acclimate to the information that reality is giving me, and now all of a sudden, relationally, Utopia lives somewhere else. And so in that way, Utopia is maybe never something that I land at permanently, but am constantly quantum leaping to these new ideas of what it is for me in the moment. And it's not a destination, it's a pit stop on the way to infinity.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. Something else that I think, like, okay, so this is kind of connected to all this stuff, and like, if you want to go real big, right, for a second, and ask like the biggest question, right? Like, so you say, what is the meaning of life? Or like, what is the purpose of life, right? So I have an answer. I know the answer.
Tell us all, Clark.
For myself, which is that basically I don't know why I was born. I don't know why I'm here. I don't know why I'm having a human experience. I don't know why I'm alive if I am alive. I don't know what's going to happen to me when I die. I don't know where I go. I don't know anything. I don't know any of these things. But what I have arrived at for me as a reason for living is to just continue to try to move in the direction of what inspires me. And what those, like you're saying, leapfrogging from this place to the next, it may be a physical place, it may be a learning experience, a relationship, but is to just try to keep moving in the direction of something that you feel in your soul, in your spirit, that makes you feel alive, and that that you care about in a deep way, you know. And it's so, like, I was just talking to a client of mine recently, and I was asking him about like his future, and he's like, I have no idea, you know. And we started talking about education and learning. And this is another thing related to me and my depression, and that it came out of that, the last round of a deep depression, because it's not the first and it probably won't be the last, is that I realized that I'm also very unhappy if I'm not learning something new that I'm interested in. And so for me, I am constantly reading a book or working on a new activity, or a game, or it could be anything. But if I am not learning, I am not happy in my soul. And so for me, that's why I'm here. That is my purpose of living, is learning. And it's like, that is a big deal for me to be able to really know that. Because I think a lot of people, if you know, we have microphones. If we walk down the beach and we interviewed like 1,000 people, and we just said, what is your purpose to be alive? Like, I mean, I'm sure our minds would be blown, first of all, but I think we would get a lot of answers of people that don't have an answer. And I think that we should all try to have an answer to that.
Yeah, well, and maybe the reason that we're so addicted at a physical and emotional level to so many things is because that's an uncomfortable question to ask.
Oh, yeah.
And especially when you can't find an answer to it.
Exactly.
Because, you know, the sense that I get is that the most powerful thing that you can say to yourself is, I don't know.
Right.
But I'm curious.
Right.
You know, it's like saying I don't know opens up a dimensional space of curiosity that allows new information to come in.
Right, totally.
But if you say I've got it all figured out, you close that dimensional space.
Totally.
And you don't open yourself up to new experiences.
Exactly.
And, you know, for many years, I was somebody who was arrogantly proclaiming, I've got it all figured out. I know what's wrong with you. I know what's wrong with me.
Yeah.
I've got it all figured out. Just ask me.
Yeah.
And I started to stagnate from that place of claiming that I knew something. And so now I'm adamant about saying, well, I've got some ideas, but I don't really know, and I like not knowing because I know I'm never going to know everything, so I'm always going to not know something. And in accepting that, I open up the dimensional landscape required for my curiosity to probe the universe and bring back to me something new for me to explore.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's like, I think basically you and I are saying the same thing from a different angle, you know? And it, to me, like, also just like, if you want to take a real logical, like, approach to it, where it's like,
I don't want to.
okay, well.
I'm kidding. Go ahead.
But is like, it sort of just kind of logically makes sense if you had to create like a scientific answer to like, what is the purpose of living? It's like to just live and experience and learn and grow. And, you know, I mean, like, learning and growth, they can mean the same thing, you know. Living and learning means the same thing, you know. Growth and living means, you know, and it's like, you know, if you look into the natural world with plants and animals beyond us, which we're obviously animals, so we're just the same thing, is I'm a gardener, and I like, working with plants is a really grounding thing for me, because I can really, if I step outside of my mind and I'm just interacting with a plant, like, what is it doing? What does this plant have to say? And I just watch it, and I just look at it, and I care for it. I see it growing and learning and living also, and it's much more subtle of a process in some ways than the dramatic experience of being a human. But, you know, you look at a plant, and if it's really dry, it's suffering. And if it's really wet, it's suffering. And if the wind is blowing too hard, it's getting thrashed about, you know. And it's like, that plant is doing the same thing that we're all doing, which is just trying to survive and grow. It's trying to grow, you know, and it goes hard. Every plant that, when it pops out of the seed, is going full blast till the day it dies. And it might live 2 days or 10,000 years. But it's just trying to live, you know? And that's what we're all doing. We're just trying to stay alive and fucking keep going. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think what I might add to that is it's also learning to iterate. You know, it's like there's a sweet spot that a plant knows it can exist at successfully, and so it's iterating itself in order to live in that sweet spot as often as possible.
Totally. Every plant and animal, everything that's alive is trying to keep its species alive. You know, it's doing everything that it is capable of doing to stay alive. You know, and I think that's what's almost the most beautiful thing about life. There's the quotes like, life creates the condition for life. And living things, although we forget this as humans a lot, I think living things are trying to help other living things stay alive also. And so it's like, we're all on the same team. You know, we're on the same team as the plants and animals and whales and snails, and everything that's alive is like, come on, man, like, let's do it together. Although, you know, there's competition and there's elements of, you know, one animal or plant sacrificing for another, you know, it's chaotic, it's chaos. But at the most core, it's like, let's just keep going, man. You know, like, it's like, and like that's beautiful, you know.
The circle of life.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, and, you know, I think that what's interesting is that, you know, we have this self-awareness, and so it's harder, I think, for us to stay in that balanced place because we can choose not to be in it. Yeah. And it's almost like we have to make the choice to be balanced, and then we have to understand what that choice means. And a big part of what I'm trying to figure out is okay, you know, what does my mind feel like? What does my body feel like? What does my soul spirit feel like when I'm in that sweet spot, when I'm balanced? And it's like, once you have a taste of it, it becomes easier to get back to that place. Yeah. But a lot of people have never even had a taste of it, depending on what their background is, or their upbringing was, or the philosophical stance that they share on reality. And so it's like you have to constantly be iterating to find the next most sweeter taste, and then maybe distance yourself enough from that sweetness to recognize that it's going to find you, perhaps. Because the schools of thought, I think, are, Eastern religion is much more about kind of watching your own movie and letting it unfold, and just being a witness to the experience, good or bad, and not putting labels on any of that, where Western thought is more about a hierarchical perspective or stance on reality, where everything is built in hierarchies, and every experience can move up that hierarchy chart, perhaps, and while there can be an infinite number of interpretations of reality, maybe there's only one or two that are good for me and good for my family and good for my community and good for the world as a whole, and good for me now, but also in 10 years from now. And so kind of understanding how my present day decisions affect me now and ripple out into the world, but also how that ripple looks 10, 50, 100 years from now. That's the interesting game that is reality. And you have to somewhat have an awareness of that you are this kind of entity or consciousness that is moving through the landscape of time and space.
Right.
And in that, you're playing a game that is larger than right now. And so, something that philosophically I wrestle with is the here and now concept. Like, if we're only living for the now, are we making the best decisions for the future version of ourselves?
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, for sure. And so along the idea of like time and space and reality, if we're going there, I think like I joke at parties sometimes with people where they'll, maybe they're complaining about something, or they're upset, or whatever, anything really. You could use this in any scenario. I go, oh, it doesn't matter, because in 9 billion years, the sun's going to explode and vaporize the earth and destroy everything that's ever been alive. So it doesn't matter, and it's like, that's true, or we think it's true, and
spoken like somebody who believes that the sun is just a nuclear reactor.
Right, exactly. And so, and it's like that. It's funny though, because it's like the perspective is like no one's really thinking on a 9 billion year long timeline, because that doesn't really make practical sense in your day-to-day life, right? And so it's kind of just a funny thing to say, but my point is that perspective is everything, kind of, and I think even, I'm not even totally convinced that, and I'm sure it's not the case, that each person is actually even perceiving things in the same way. I mean, like small examples, like people who are colorblind or blind or deaf, or maybe they have a weird skin disorder that they can't feel anything. It's like just things like that. It's like, okay, if you want to talk about reality, then the reality is that person's reality literally is different than yours, like structurally different.
Yeah.
And that's just taking time and space out of the equation. That's just like right now what they experience, And so I think like, and also I think our minds are so powerful that people can create any reality they want for themselves and convince themselves of any reality, and we already all do that. Like, so basically everybody is living their own reality anyway, which is a part of the reason why I think it's so complicated for us to live in harmony with each other. Because if you have people that are literally living in a different time, space, perspective reality from each other, how are they going to connect and communicate in relationship, in society, in culture? And I think that's why, if you look out through the entire history of humanity and you look at where we are now, anywhere in the world, that it's such a mess. But also it's not a mess because everyone is doing this is talking about being kind of benevolence again too. I like to believe, I hope to believe, I want to believe that everybody really is doing the best they can with what they've got and who they are and their experience. And, I do believe that everyone is trying to be the best they can. And some people are still not very good. But, and that could be just in relation to me, But so if you go, everybody's doing the best they can, and you come back to that elements of nature, everybody's just trying to survive, And so that to me is like, that's kind of like the ultimate reality. What reality is just comes back to that sentence is everyone is just trying to survive. That's what reality is, and that's it. There's an infinite iteration of how that's unfolding, and there's an infinite perspectives on why and how, whatever. But if you just look to the natural world, which we are of, it's just survival,
Right, but maybe that's a flawed premise. I'm going to play the devil's advocate here, because
sure.
There's also a stance on reality that reality is just this giant organism that's eating itself to have a growth experience, and
I'm not familiar with that, John.
Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail.
Okay,
it's this idea that reality is constantly cycling itself by eating itself and then recycling, and so that's why the plant dies and it becomes part of the earth, and the seeds go into the earth and then they sprout back up. It is the circle of life. That's the Ouroboros.
Okay.
And if we stop trying to survive, since death at a physical level is inevitable,
right,
maybe we can transcend into having an experience of the eternal nature of that cycle, and perhaps there's a peace in no longer pushing against that natural cycle,
right,
and instead just going with the flow, which is why I like the Eastern concept of becoming the witness of your own life.
Right.
It can
well,
be.
and again, like, okay, so what you're saying, that makes sense and is really kind of epic, really, if you really think about it. But it's also very similar to what I was saying. It's a different way of saying what I think I was trying to communicate earlier about process. Like, it's not a destination. If we're talking about the circle of life, what's the destination at the end of a circle? It's not. You can't do it. Or a elliptical sphere, or whatever, or the infinite figure eight loop. Where's the beginning and the end? There isn't. So if you get comfortable in that knowing of that there is no beginning, there is no time, there is no space, there is no reality, there is no life, there is no death, it's all of it, there's none of it. If somehow you could exist mentally and spiritually and psychologically in that space, then you achieve it all, right? I mean, you're there.
Yeah, well, I think technically that is the enlightenment space that Eastern philosophy talks about. And one of the ways that I attempt...
Well, let's just be there, dude.
Yeah, well, one of the ways that I attempt to have that experience is, instead of judging the things in my life as good or bad,
right,
I've started saying, well, that's interesting.
Right.
And so I'm becoming interested in my life instead of judging that it should be something different.
Right.
And that, to me, has been an interesting way to interpret reality, because, when we watch a movie, we kind of need the villain in the movie in order for the story arc to play itself out. And our lives, I don't think, are that different. The reason that we write the same archetypical stories over and over and over again in art, film, literature, etc., is because that is the archetypical loop that we ourselves are living. And when we learn to become witness to the movie of our lives, it can become, at least for me, it has become a much more enjoyable experience.
Right.
Because just like a movie, I'm saying, wow, I don't know what's going to happen next, but I sure am on the edge of my fucking seat.
Yeah, right. And that is awesome. I think that's awesome. And I think that if there's, like, if we're saying we're recording this conversation for some reason, to put it out into the world, and maybe someone will care or it'll help them in some kind of way or something, is I think, like, this is definitely something that's difficult for me, and I agree with what you're saying, which is, can you shift your daily perceptions away from your fears, from your anxieties, from your angers, from your blaming the external world, from all of these things, to a complete and total acceptance space, and then moving even beyond acceptance into excitement for whatever comes next, which is exactly what you just said. And another like corollary point to make that is, when I was in college, I had this really intense diversity training, and one of the things that stuck with me in that training was the concept of all of these different words that people use in society to describe certain things. So like a big word in, say, in a media space is like, or you see it printed on posters or something, is like zero tolerance, or we have tolerance for this or that, which is interesting because tolerance is like this. It's like, that's not totally positive. It's like we barely tolerate this, right? But it's like seen as like we tolerate this, But then you go, okay, well, what's like a word that's like a little more than that, like a little more than just tolerance? It's like acceptance. We accept this, right? We accept all these people and all their crazy rollerblades or whatever, right? And then you go, okay, well, acceptance is pretty good, but that's still like, that's not like the best. Like, we can kind of do better. So what is after acceptance? Appreciation, right? And you get to a place and you go, man, we love those rollerblader kids in the hallway. They're great. They're crazy.
We're gonna build them a ramp.
Instead of the grandpa at home that's like, I don't tolerate these rollerblading in my yard. You know what I mean? And so it's like, but that's like a huge thing when you think about it. And so if you apply that like to your life, where you're like, I tolerate this life, or whatever, and then you're like, I accept all this shit, whatever, to going like, I appreciate deeply this hard experience I'm going through right now. Like, and you mean it, you feel it. That's a fundamentally different way to exist as a person, And it's like easy to say that, but it's like, yeah, it's hard to get to a place that you live in appreciation, particularly when it's hard.
Yeah.
And like, I have felt that before in my life when I'm in a deeply horrible experience. I've felt appreciation simultaneously, but it's not like every day,
Yeah, well, and I think, for me, one of the ways that it becomes easier is I say, okay, well, I'm going to try to view my life as a piece of living art and observe my life the way that I would the work of an artist. And in that way, the same way that you do with art, you start to see yourself in the circumstances around you, and so it becomes this kind of mirror experience where you're subjectively filtering the art through your own experiences, and the art happens to be your own experience, so it creates this feedback loop.
Yeah.
But then, also in that, you recognize that you have a certain amount of say as the artist of your own life, or at least the mechanism that the art is being created from your vantage point. And by allowing yourself to be guided as that mechanism, then just like in a movie, it can be a really sad movie, but it can be beautiful. You can experience your life in the same way, and you understand that in order for a story to be a great story, there has to be certain ups and downs in narrative. And the sense that I get is that I often create an experience that is uncomfortable at first so that I can have an experience of overcoming it, which is so exhilarating. And that experience of discomfort showing up in my life, and then me being able to find the mechanism or solution to then overcome that and become bigger than the challenge is so exhilarating and happens to me so often that I have gained a faith that I will always be able to overcome whatever comes up in my life. And so when it comes up, the first thing that I say to myself is, well, this will be really interesting to see how this plays out, because I'm expectant that at some point I will become bigger than the challenge before me, and I'm excited about that growth process, but I have no idea how it will unfold.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I have a less proactive approach to it. I wait for bad things to happen to me, and then I hope I survive them. but it's like, either way, it's all coming, you know. Something is coming. And so we have to figure out how to move forward through it, you know, until we no longer do. And then maybe we do again. And, you know, and that's the great mystery for me. The ultimate great mystery is I feel like I only have a very limited perception of what my experience is now. And you know, I think, you know, a lot of people have a fear of death, you know, for very understandable reasons. I mean, it seems scary to just be like, okay, I was alive and then now I'm not, you know. But I don't have a huge fear of death. I have a fear of getting old and being sick and suffering, you know, but that's also probably inevitable, you know, so you have to accept it. But like for me, I think, like, again, yeah, you're going back to the full circle, and the circle is that whatever happens in death is what's going to happen. And you know, a lot of people in religion, a lot of what religion about is actually creating an answer for afterlife, right? And for me, it's interesting because I'm like, man, why try that? I mean, like, man, it's just like getting up in the morning is hard enough to figure out. Like, why are we trying to create an idea of what happens after we die? It's like too much, you know. We'll find out, you know, that it's coming for us whether we want it or not, you know. And the same thing with, and back to your saying, I don't know, you know, like for me, we didn't really get into any of this category, but religiously, the way that I feel very clear about my perspective from a religious standpoint, which is I consider myself agnostic. And a lot of people are confused by what that word actually means, but the way that I understand it or interpret it is that being agnostic is saying, I don't know. Ultimately, that's what it's saying, I don't know. And so for me, like I say, I don't know where I came from. I don't know why I'm here. I don't know where I'm going to go. I don't know anything. The only thing I do know that I already said earlier is that I should try to move in the direction that inspires me, because that's the best answer I can come up with. And I've thought about it forever, you know. And that's the one thing that I feel like is worth having an answer for, is at least, why am I alive right now? You know, and all of the other stuff, I'm completely okay with the process.
Yeah, well, and for me, one of the reasons that I feel like I've experimented, you know, so deeply with so many different metaphysical, spiritual, and religious practices is because it's almost like, you know, whether any of those are true or not, I think that they all offer an interesting vehicle for consciousness to experience reality. And so it's like in real life, my physical form can travel around on a moped or in a Porsche or in a, you know, sailboat. There are all these different vehicles that I can have an experience of motion through the physical plane. And religion and many spiritual practices, to me, are vehicles for having an experience of consciousness in motion through the landscape of reality. Yeah. And I've had incredibly powerful experiences with almost all of them, because when you go deep enough into anything and you learn how to truly try a belief system on and see through the lens of it, I do think that there is a subjective quality to reality that will then mirror those principles back to you. And, you know, I am not someone who believes that all of the old spiritual texts are somehow outdated because they were written by people who aren't scientists.
Right.
I've never taken a reductionist viewpoint of reality, because it feels more fun to me to expect that there is something we still don't know.
Yeah.
And maybe there's not, but feeling like there is and interpreting reality through that lens has been an interesting experience for me.
Yeah.
And so right now I continue to do that.
Right.
But to your point, I don't know for certain.
Yeah.
I know that when I do certain things, my life feels a certain way, and when I do other things, it feels a different way, and I tend to gravitate towards the experiences that feel more fulfilling and satisfying.
Yep.
But I've also really been trying to open myself up to mystery and experiencing the unknown and running headfirst into my fears, having faith that I will, in that running towards experience, become bigger than the fear and overcome them. And to me, the most satisfying experience that is available to me right now is how do I develop courage in the largest capacity possible and then enact it.
Yeah. You got a lot going on.
Well, I think that, reality is this really interesting landscape, and there's a lot to choose from. There's billions and billions of data points, and we can all tune in to whichever data points we want.
Totally.
And I'm having an interesting experience of being able to process what feels to me like a larger number of data points than I used to be able to process in a single moment. And that feels like a more multidimensional or vivid or colorful experience of reality. And I get the sense that the more that I have an expectation that I will have the processing power available to interpret and enact myself within a reality experience, the bigger those experiences can become.
Yeah.
But it's like you have to step into the bigger experience first before you're given the processing power to handle it.
Yeah.
And maybe depression is something where you know that a larger experience is available to you, but at some level there's a latent emotional program running in the background that says it's not worth the discomfort to even go for it because you might fail or it might be too difficult. So why even try? And so then you live in this existential funk that is the representation of you not going for the bigger experience, and in doing so choosing to be bigger yourself.
Yeah, I mean, that's possible for sure in a certain reflections of depression. I think, for me, the way that when I think about depression generally in a larger sense, I have started to understand that everyone is kind of having their own experience even within that. Mm-hmm. When I've talked with other people about their experience in depression, it's like, that's not really how I have experienced it, or whatever. And it's interesting to hear, when you get close enough with someone where they can open up to you and share that sort of darker space with you. It's interesting to hear and understand different people's experiences in that space. And, for example, I've got a friend who is a severe alcoholic. He's been that way for years, and he's a very intellectual person. And he has shared with me, that his alcoholism is a self-defense mechanism for his depression that he feels. And at the core of his depression, the way that I understand it, that he's communicated to me, is that he doesn't know what his purpose is, and he's tormented by that, and that's kind of interesting, because it's like, I don't think that that's where it comes from for me, and so I think it's just like, everyone is, even in the highs and lows, everyone, even in those spaces, everyone is really experiencing it in their own way, and that is like, to maybe almost this could be like a closing thought or something. I don't know. We should probably go swim in the ocean, right? Yeah. Is last night you and I were having a conversation about a relationship that I'm coming out of, or in some sort of transition, or it's over or something, I don't know, is that one of the things that you said to me in a very long chat was about me and my judgments and sort of projections onto that person, and like how that's been something that you've tried to work on in yourself. And it's like, it was a big important reminder or thing for me in the same way, to not put my thoughts or ideas or feelings on other people's experiences. And like, I really realized that I have done that a lot in this relationship that I've been in, and that's something that is not positive, I don't think, for either one of us, so I don't, you elaborate even further on it, because the way you articulated to me was really great.
Yeah, well, I think for me it was one of those things where it's difficult if you're branding yourself as a coach or a teacher or something to not want to constantly be coaching people.
Right.
And so I got myself in this trap where I was constantly intuiting what was wrong with somebody and then projecting my advice onto them. Now, that doesn't mean that I was always verbalizing that advice, but in my head, the chatter of what I felt was wrong with them and what I felt they should do to correct that was always going. So energetically, I was projecting that at them, and then that was creating a feedback loop that they were then mirroring back to me. And I recognized that that was a huge emotional addiction that I had, was needing to know why everything was happening.
Right.
And assuming that the way that I was seeing it from my vantage point was the way that everyone else should see it.
Yeah.
And that was a completely flawed premise. And so one of the things that I started to do as I, was developing this concept of becoming transparent to life and letting people have their experience, and my girlfriend, pulled me kicking and screaming into this because she's so good at letting other people have their own experiences. Yeah. And I wasn't. And I see her so vividly being someone who can just allow someone to be who they need to be in that moment. And I've used her as a model to figure out how to do that for myself. And it's been wildly beneficial as a coach, because no longer am I projecting onto someone some kind of judgment or fault, but rather I'm letting them have their experience, and I'm prompting them with questions more often than not that allow them to express what they need to express from their current vantage point. And I'm recognizing that our brains and our spirit and our soul are so powerful that they will bring forward whatever garbage needs to be released in order to have a healing experience. And the style of coaching that I do now is strictly question-oriented. I'm not layering any information on top of people. I'm only asking questions and letting whatever bubbles up inside of them come to the surface and have a safe space for expression. And in that expression, I watch people in front of me transform and have their own intuitions about what to do with their lives. And oftentimes, their intuition about what they should do is not the advice that I would have given them, but it is clear the advice that they needed at the place that they're currently standing.
Right.
And that is a difficult concept because for me it was anyway, it was a difficult concept because I was so good at seeing my own flaws in other people and then judging those things.
Yeah.
And that's why I really like this existential strategy that I'm experimenting now, which is that reality is a mirror, because more often than not, I hear myself when I am just in conversation giving people advice or explaining my viewpoint on things or trying to help someone interpret their own scenario. I hear myself saying things to other people and recognizing, oh, this is for me. I'm saying this out loud. I drew this person to me who had this experience so that I could have a realization of potentially what the solution to that type of scenario is, and then I would be able to vocalize it out loud and have my own awareness about how I can then apply that same advice to my own life. And one of the reasons that I wanted to start having these long-form conversations with people is not so much that I feel I have something magnificent to offer the world that they need to hear, that they're not going to be able to hear from someone else. It's that I believe that expression is the way that we heal ourselves, and that clarity comes from properly communicating our ideas and solidifying them in a linear manner. There's a certain magic to speaking something out loud, and my hope is that when I'm having conversations with people like you or anyone who comes onto this podcast, that we will both walk away somewhat transformed because of the conversation. And if there's any way to capture that magic and have it ripple out into reality, that's the reason for posting it online. But more than anything, it's just to showcase that in a 140 character world, long form conversation is still really valuable, and we don't see that a lot. Like, even with my closest friends, I don't get to have really long conversations with them. Almost always we're screaming at the top of the lungs, in a bar or in some scenario where getting intimate isn't an option.
Right.
And I'm attempting to break that false premise and barrier and become comfortable with intimacy with people at all levels, wherever I'm at.
Yeah.
Being able to convey my truth in every moment without fear that I'll be rejected.
Yeah. Well, and as kind of a final thought for me, tying it all together about that, it's like that is you living the art of your life, right?
Yeah.
Expression, conversation and communication and words and language and a long format sit down intimate conversation with someone is art.
Yeah.
It's like that's like we're having an artful experience of our life, like right now in this moment, and that's freaking awesome. Like I agree, it's great. Like I appreciate I tolerate you, John, and I accept you, but I also I really appreciate the fact that we're here in paradise right now, and it feels like it in this moment,
Well, the sun is shining. We're under some beautiful shade. The ocean continues to become more and more blue.
Yeah.
We're seeing these beautiful sails of ships out in the distance pass by. The sand is calling us to ground a little bit, and I think it's a perfect closing. Because this isn't, while this is such a beautiful setting, it's not necessarily paradise for me in this moment because of the beauty. That's certainly enhancing it, but it has been a paradise experience this weekend because of the people that I've been able to hang out with, because of the conversations that we've had, and because we've collectively created an energy and an environment between our group that has felt uplifting and full of love. And ultimately, that is the experience of reality that I want to have, is learning to experience and receive love as vividly as I can.
Yeah.
And so on that note, we'll close here outside the Honolulu Zoo, looking out over Waikiki Beach. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in, and we shall see you next time.
Aloha.
Aloha and mahalo.